In every neighborhood, there's always one person who believes the rules don't just apply to them, they belong to them. For this community, that person was Karen, the loudest and most self-proclaimed enforcer of the HOA. She had made it her personal mission to dictate what every neighbor could and could not do. And nothing fueled her obsession more than the sight of a Jeep parked behind a locked gate. To her, it was an eyesore, a violation of her imagined authority. She mailed warnings, barked at board meetings, and even rallied a few like-minded residents. But when the homeowner refused to bend, Karen grew restless. Armed with bolt cutters and arrogance, she snapped the lock in broad daylight. What she didn't know was that the Jeep wasn't just a car. It was property connected to law enforcement, and her reckless act was about to cost her everything.
The neighborhood had always been quiet, the kind of place where the sound of sprinklers at dawn and children on bicycles in the evening defined the rhythm of daily life. Rows of manicured lawns stretched across the cul-de-sac with homes, painted in muted, uniform shades, approved by the HOA, from a distance. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but beneath the surface, tension brewed. The homeowners association had a reputation for being strict, but in this community, there was one person who carried its authority like a weapon. Karen was more than just a neighbor. She was the unofficial patrol, the eyes that scanned every driveway, the ears that listened for violations, and the voice that never stopped complaining. Her name was whispered in frustration across fences and in hushed tones at barbecues. She had thrived on control, finding purpose in pointing out the smallest infractions: trash bins not pulled in fast enough, grass a little too tall, cars parked just a few inches past the curb. But nothing provoked her anger more than the sight of one particular Jeep. The Jeep belonged to a man who kept mostly to himself. He wasn't unfriendly, but he avoided neighborhood drama and rarely engaged in the HOA's endless debates. To him, the Jeep was more than just a vehicle. It was part of his livelihood. He worked closely with law enforcement in ways most neighbors didn't know, and the Jeep served a purpose far beyond transportation. But Karen didn't see that. All she saw was a vehicle she didn't like. She called it an eyesore, claimed it lowered property values, and insisted that it violated community guidelines. Her campaign against the Jeep started with letters. At first, they were the generic notices from the HOA, carefully worded warnings about non-compliance and fines. But when the man ignored them, the letters became more frequent and more personal. Karen would type out her own demands, leaving them tucked under his doormat or taped to his gate. She would mutter loudly about disrespect during HOA meetings, ensuring that anyone present knew she was waging a battle. Still, nothing changed. The Jeep remained parked in its place, locked behind a heavy chain and padlock, a silent reminder that Karen's authority was limited. That lock became a symbol of defiance to her, a direct challenge she could not ignore. Each time she passed by, she stared at it with narrowed eyes, her mind turning over ways to reassert control. Neighbors noticed, some rolled their eyes, whispering about her obsession. Others avoided getting involved, not wanting to be the target of her wrath. But everyone knew Karen was plotting something. She had always taken matters into her own hands when she felt ignored, and this was no different. What Karen didn't know was that her behavior had already been noted. Cameras discreetly placed around the property captured her constant prowling, her late-night stops near the gate, her pictures taken with her phone as if she were collecting evidence. The homeowner wasn't naive. He knew her type. He knew her fixation could escalate, and he chose patience, waiting as she walked deeper into her own mistake. Karen's obsession grew until one day, she could no longer contain it. She bought a pair of bolt cutters, hiding them in her trunk. To her, the lock was not just a padlock, it was a wall standing between her and victory. She convinced herself that by breaking it, she was upholding the rules of the community, protecting the neighborhood from a blight. It was self-righteousness mixed with arrogance, and it blinded her to the consequences. The morning she chose to act was clear and quiet. Sunlight fell across the cul-de-sac. Children had already gone to school, and most adults were at work. Karen parked her car at the curb, glancing around as if she were performing a routine errand. She walked toward the gate, her bag heavy with the cutters. Her pulse quickened with anticipation. To her, this was justice, a moment where she would prove once again that no one could ignore her authority. The cutters clamped down on the metal. The padlock resisted, groaning under the pressure, but then it snapped. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the stillness of the street. Karen froze for a second, then smiled, feeling the rush of triumph. She had won. The barrier was gone, and the Jeep was hers to control. But in the shadows, cameras recorded everything. Every step, every glance, every second of her unlawful intrusion was captured. To the homeowner, watching the feed later, it wasn't anger he felt, but quiet satisfaction. She had given him all the evidence he needed, and she didn't even realize it. Neighbors who saw her linger at the gate didn't confront her, but they whispered among themselves later. Some shook their heads, muttering that she had gone too far. Others quietly hoped this would finally be the moment she faced consequences. But Karen, blinded by her sense of victory, strutted back to her car, leaving the broken lock on the ground like a trophy. What she couldn't imagine was that the Jeep wasn't just another vehicle. It wasn't simply the homeowner's property. Was connected to a police task force. By cutting that lock, she hadn't just trespassed. She had interfered with law enforcement property, crossing a line that would drag her into a storm much bigger than any HOA dispute she had ever started. As she drove away, convinced she had won, the real story was only beginning. The evidence was in hand, the homeowner had made his calls, and the first wheels of justice were already turning. For Karen, the lock was broken, but the consequences she had just unleashed would soon break her pride, and that was only the beginning. Karen's victory was short-lived, but in her mind it was the beginning of a new era. She strutted around the neighborhood with a sense of pride that only she could carry. To her, breaking that lock was not a crime, it was justice. She believed she had restored order, removed an unsightly vehicle, and reminded everyone that she was the enforcer of the HOA's unspoken laws. She even allowed herself to hint at it during casual conversations with other residents, carefully dropping remarks about how certain people in the community needed to be taught lessons when they refused to follow the rules. What she didn't know was that while she was celebrating, others were watching closely. Several neighbors had seen her at the gate with the bolt cutters, and even those who usually kept quiet were unsettled. They whispered at mailboxes, exchanged glances across lawns, and shook their heads in quiet disapproval. Everyone knew Karen was controlling, but this act had crossed a line. The broken lock left lying on the ground was undeniable proof of her intrusion. The homeowner, meanwhile, remained calm. He didn't storm to her door or cause a scene. Instead, he reviewed the footage from the cameras carefully, ensuring that every angle of her actions was clear. Her face was caught in perfect detail. Her posture, as she leaned on the cutters, the expression of smug satisfaction as the lock snapped, it was all there. He saved the files, copied them onto multiple drives, and forwarded them to his contacts. In law enforcement, for him, there was no need to confront her personally. The evidence would speak for itself, and Karen's downfall would come not with shouting, but with silence. The Jeep, still parked behind the now unchained gate, stood as a silent witness. Karen thought she had stripped the homeowner of control, but in reality, she had set in motion a chain of events that would remove control from her hands entirely. She was blind to the truth that Jeep was not just a vehicle. It had been used in ongoing surveillance operations, connected to a police task force that relied on discretion and trust. By interfering with it, she had stepped into territory far beyond neighborhood politics. As the day went on, Karen's arrogance grew. She paraded around the HOA meeting that evening, dropping sharp comments about standards and upholding rules. Though she didn't mention the Jeep directly, everyone in the room knew what she was implying. A few members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unwilling to challenge her openly but no longer fully supportive. Some of them feared that if they sided with her now, they might be dragged into whatever storm was building. Outside that meeting, the homeowner remained quiet. He knew the investigation had already begun. Officers reviewed the footage, recognized the nature of the property, and escalated the matter. Cutting a lock on a neighbor's gate was one thing. Tampering with a vehicle tied to law enforcement was another. The difference meant Karen's actions were not just petty but criminal, carrying consequences she could not imagine. But Karen's confidence blinded her. In her mind, she had won, and that made her reckless. She began bragging more openly, telling a few neighbors that she had handled the Jeep situation herself. She wanted them to know that she had power, that her authority extended beyond warnings and fines. She wanted to be feared and respected, and for a short moment, she believed she had achieved both. Her downfall, however, had already begun. The homeowner's report was thorough, backed by undeniable evidence. The police didn't need speculation or witness statements. They had video proof of her crime. Each frame captured her intent, her intrusion, and her theft of authority. She never had. The investigation deepened quietly, and officers prepared the next steps. Meanwhile, tension in the neighborhood grew. Some residents started avoiding Karen altogether, crossing the street rather than risk conversation. Others exchanged knowing looks, silently acknowledging that her obsession had finally gone too far. For years, she had bullied and intimidated, but now, for the first time, there was a sense that she might actually face consequences. Karen, though, mistook their silence for compliance. She thought her neighbors admired her boldness, that they respected her for doing what the HOA was too weak to do officially. She carried herself taller, her voice louder, her demands sharper. She had no idea that behind closed doors, the very people she believed supported her were quietly waiting for the moment when she would fall. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. Late one evening, 2 patrol cars rolled quietly into the cul-de-sac. Their lights weren't flashing, their sirens weren't blaring, but their presence was unmistakable. They parked at the edge of the street, officers stepping out with purpose. Neighbors peeked through blinds and curtains, whispers rippling across the block as they realized something serious was unfolding. Karen, standing in her driveway, froze. At first, she assumed the police had come for someone else. She looked around, waiting for them to knock on another door. But as the officers walked straight toward her, the color drained from her face. She tried to greet them with her usual confidence, but her words faltered when she saw the evidence folder in their hands. The officers spoke calmly, but their tone left no room for argument. They explained the situation, laying out the details of her intrusion. They showed her still images from the video, each one undeniable proof of her actions. Karen stammered, tried to spin excuses about community standards and protecting property values, but none of it mattered. The lock, the cutters, the G-pit was all too clear. The neighbors watched silently as Karen's bravado crumbled for the first time. The woman who had made herself judge and jury of the neighborhood stood powerless. The officers didn't need to raise their voices. The weight of the truth was enough. The homeowner remained inside his house, watching from a distance. He didn't need to confront her directly. Justice was unfolding exactly as it should. He had waited patiently, and now the system was doing what it was meant to do. By the time the officers finished, Karen's confidence had shattered. She wasn't arrested that night, but she was left with a summons and the knowledge that she had crossed a line she couldn't erase. The neighborhood, once her stage, now felt like a prison. Everywhere she turned, eyes were on her, not with fear, but with quiet satisfaction. And as she retreated into her house, the whispers grew louder. The queen of the HOA had fallen, and her empire of control was beginning to crumble. Karen barely slept that night. The officer's visit had left her shaken, but her pride wouldn't allow her to admit it. She replayed the confrontation in her mind, twisting it into a story where she was the victim, unfairly targeted for simply doing her duty. Her narrative shifted from confidence to self-pity, but in both versions she refused to accept blame. She told herself she had been misunderstood, but the police didn't see the bigger picture. That she was the one protecting the neighborhood while others were too cowardly to act. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial, fear had settled. The next morning, the cul-de-sac was alive with whispers. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now couldn't resist exchanging quiet glances whenever Karen passed by. They spoke in hushed tones about the patrol cars, the folder of evidence, and the way Karen's face had drained of color as the officers confronted her. For years, she had carried herself as untouchable, but now her cracks were showing. Karen tried to regain control of the narrative. She went door to door, pretending it was business as usual. At one house, she complained about false accusations. At another, she hinted that the police were overstepping their authority. But the neighbors weren't convinced. They listened, politely, nodded vaguely, and then shut their doors quickly. Behind those doors, the whispers grew stronger. Meanwhile, the homeowner remained silent. He didn't brag, didn't stir the pot, didn't even acknowledge Karen's attempts to spin the story. He kept to himself, confident that the evidence already in the hands of law enforcement was more powerful than any rumor Karen could spread. Silence was his weapon, and Karen's own desperation made it sharper. But Karen's ego wouldn't let her stop. She doubled down, calling an emergency HOA meeting. In that meeting, she ranted about uncooperative residents, about vehicles that damaged property values, and about her responsibility to enforce rules. Her words were frantic, her tone sharp, and her eyes wild with determination. For years, the HOA board had humored her, tolerating her aggression to avoid conflict. This time, though, they sat quietly. One board member shifted uncomfortably in his chair, another cleared her throat nervously, but no one voiced support. They had seen the patrol cars too, and they wanted no part of the storm surrounding Karen. As the meeting ended, Karen felt the sting of isolation. Her allies were gone, her authority questioned, and her image shattered. Yet instead of pulling back, she dug deeper. In her mind, she was fighting not just for control of the neighborhood, but for her very identity. Without power, without the title of enforcer, she was nothing. The homeowner, meanwhile, received updates from his law enforcement contacts. The case was moving forward, with charges being considered for trespassing, property damage, and interference with police property. Each charge carried weight, and together they painted a picture of deliberate wrongdoing. Karen might have believed she was untouchable, but the law didn't see it that way. The Jeep remained in place, untouched since the incident. Its quiet presence was both a symbol and a reminder. For Karen, it was a constant taunt, sitting there as if mocking her failed attempt at control. For the homeowner, it was a steady reassurance that patience always pays off. Days passed, and the tension only grew. Neighbors avoided Karen entirely now, crossing the street when she walked her dog, refusing to meet her eyes during morning jogs. The children, once oblivious, even began to sense the shift. They whispered about the mean lady who had been in trouble with the police, their young voices echoing the conversations of their parents. Karen's anger turned inward, then outward. She began writing furious letters, slipping them into mailboxes late at night. Some accused the homeowner of being a troublemaker. Others warned neighbors that the community was at risk because of him. But instead of rallying support, the letters only deepened her isolation. Residents passed them around like strange artifacts, shaking their heads at the lengths she would go to maintain her illusion of power. The homeowner collected copies of the letters they were evidence. More proof of harassment, more strings. In the web Karen was weaving around herself. He didn't need to respond. Every act she committed now only strengthened the case against her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, 2 unmarked cars pulled into the neighborhood. They weren't there for a dramatic arrest, but their presence was enough to send ripples through the street. Officers met quietly with the homeowner, gathering final details, ensuring the timeline of Karen's actions was airtight. From her window, Karen watched nervously, her heart pounding as she realized this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. That night, she paced her living room, muttering about conspiracies and unfair treatment. She told herself the homeowner must have tricked the police, that he was manipulating the system. The idea that she was simply in the wrong never crossed her mind. To admit that would be to shatter the identity she had built for herself. But the walls were closing in. Neighbors no longer feared her. The HOA board no longer backed her. The police no longer tolerated her. And the homeowner, Tom and steady, no longer even acknowledged her presence. In every way that mattered, Karen had already lost. Yet pride is a dangerous thing. Instead of surrendering, she began plotting again. She told herself she needed one last push, one final act to prove she was right. She began watching the Jeep more closely, circling the block at odd hours, her paranoia growing. Each night she convinced herself the vehicle's presence was an insult, a direct challenge, and each morning her resentment deepened. Karen didn't know it yet, but her story was spiraling toward a climax. The more she fought, the more she revealed, the more she tried to control, the more she lost control. And soon, the police would return not with warnings, but with consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. Her empire of intimidation was crumbling, brick by brick, and the final collapse was only a matter of time. The neighborhood had shifted, but once felt like Karen's kingdom was now hostile ground, a place where every window seemed to watch her, and every quiet conversation felt like it was about her. The silence of her neighbors stung worse than words. Doors closed a little faster when she walked by. Greetings vanished, replaced by cold stares or, worse, total indifference. For someone who thrived on control, the absence of recognition was suffocating. But Karen refused to accept defeat. She clung to the idea that she was the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by the homeowner. In her mind, he was manipulating the entire neighborhood, twisting events, and hiding behind his connections. The visit from the unmarked police cars had only fueled her paranoia. She convinced herself that the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle but some secret weapon used against her, a deliberate insult parked in plain sight. Her obsession deepened. Night after night, she circled the block, her headlights sweeping across the same driveway, her eyes fixated on the chained gate. She would slow her car almost to a crawl, staring at the Jeep as though it mocked her from behind its bars. Each lap only tightened the knot in her chest. She felt powerless. And for Karen, powerlessness was unacceptable. The homeowner, meanwhile, observed everything. His cameras didn't just record her past intrusion, they now captured her late-night prowls, the slow roll of her car, the suspicious lingering by the curb. Each clip added another layer to the growing archive of evidence, but he remained silent, never confronting her, never giving her the satisfaction of a direct fight. His calm silence was the sharpest retaliation, and it drove Karen mad. The HOA board finally reached a breaking point. At the next meeting, they addressed the growing unrest. Residents were uneasy, tired of Karen's antics, and the board could no longer afford to be complicit. One member raised the possibility of removing her from her self-appointed position as rule enforcer, while another suggested formal action to limit her influence. For years, they had feared her wrath, but now, emboldened by the homeowners, quiet defiance, and the police involvement, they saw an opportunity to reclaim balance. Karen, of course, attended that meeting. She arrived, armed with binders of violations, photographs of minor infractions, and her usual determination to dominate the room. But as she ranted, she noticed the shift. Where once the board members had nodded along nervously, now they sat stone-faced. When she demanded action against the Jeep again, one member calmly replied that the matter was already under police review and out of the HOA's hands. The silence that followed crushed Karen's spirit. For the first time, she felt the weight of being dismissed. Her fury only grew. She stormed out of the meeting, her binder of violations clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. Outside, she paced the parking lot, muttering to herself. She couldn't let it end this way. To her, backing down meant erasing her entire identity. She had built her reputation on being the enforcer, the one who kept the community in line. Without that role, she was nothing. That night, she made her boldest mistake yet. Convinced she could reclaim her authority, Karen returned to the Jeep. She parked a few houses away, creeping back toward the gate on foot. In her hands, she carried a flashlight and another pair of cutters. Her plan was reckless, almost desperate. She wanted to prove that she still had power, that no lock or chain could stop her. But she wasn't alone. What she didn't know was that law enforcement had been waiting, watching the property closely ever since her first break-in. They anticipated she might return, her arrogance pulling her back to the scene. Unmarked cars sat quietly at the edge of the neighborhood, their occupants patient, their cameras rolling. Karen crouched at the gate, her flashlight beam bouncing across the metal. She tugged at the new lock, muttering about violations and property values. The cutters clamped down, and she strained with all her strength. The sound of metal groaning filled the air. But before the lock could snap, headlights flared. To life behind her, she froze. The quiet street suddenly lit up, shadows stretching across the pavement. The unmarked vehicles rolled forward, engines slow but unmistakable. Officers stepped out, their presence calm but commanding. Karen turned slowly, her face pale, her hands trembling as she dropped the cutters. This time, there was no polite conversation, no gentle warning. The officers had seen enough. They explained that her actions had escalated from harassment to criminal trespassing and attempted tampering with police property. The words hit her like blows, each one tearing down the facade. She had clung to, she stammered, tried to argue, but her voice faltered under the weight of reality. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and blinds, their whispers spreading like wildfire. They watched the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA reduced to a desperate figure caught red-handed. Some felt pity, others satisfaction, but all knew they were witnessing the end of Karen's reign. The homeowner, still inside, didn't rush out to gloat. He didn't need to. His patience, his silence, had brought this moment to life. As the officers escorted Karen away, her cries echoing down the cul-de-sac, he simply closed his blinds and returned to his quiet evening. For Karen, the humiliation was unbearable. The image of her being caught, the whispers of neighbors, the cold reality of police involvement was more than she had ever imagined. But the storm wasn't over yet. Legal consequences loomed. The HOA was preparing to distance itself from her entirely, and the community she once ruled now viewed her as a cautionary tale. Her empire of intimidation had crumbled completely, but the true fallout was still to come. The morning after Karen's late-night confrontation with law enforcement, the neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter, the tension that had hung over the cul-de-sac for months seemed to dissipate, and for the first time in years, people lingered on sidewalks without glancing nervously over their shoulders. It was as though the entire community had taken a collective breath of relief. But beneath that calm surface, Karen's downfall was only beginning to unravel. Her arrest wasn't a quiet incident hidden in paperwork. Word spread quickly, whispered first between neighbors, then shared in phone calls, then spilling out into online community forums. Photos of her being led away in the glow of squad car headlights circulated, feeding a narrative she couldn't control. She was no longer the feared enforcer of rules. She was the subject of gossip, ridicule, and worst of all to her pity. Karen returned home later that day, her face pale, her shoulders slumped. The bold, self-assured figure who had once marched from door to door with notices and threats now carried the weight of humiliation in every step. She avoided eye contact, her once proud strut reduced to a cautious shuffle. Neighbors watched, from porches, some with folded arms, others with quiet satisfaction, as she slipped back into her house. But the HOA board wasn't done with her. That evening, an emergency meeting was called, not in the familiar hall where Karen once dominated conversations, but virtually. To avoid confrontation, the board members had grown tired of her antics and feared further escalation. The consensus was clear: Karen needed to be stripped of her authority. No more self-appointed patrols, no more endless letters. No more intimidation disguised as HOA business. For years, Karen had been allowed to wield unchecked power, but now, with evidence of her crimes piling up and the police formally involved, the board finally had the justification they needed. They voted unanimously to bar her from any HOA decision-making role. Notices were drafted, ready to be delivered directly to her mailbox. A bitter irony for someone who had weaponized those same envelopes against so many. Inside her home, Karen spiraled. She sat surrounded by her binders of evidence, flipping through photographs of fences, grass clippings, and minor violations that suddenly felt meaningless. The walls that once reinforced her sense of control now pressed in, suffocating her with silence. She convinced herself that she had been betrayed, that the entire community had turned against her out of jealousy or manipulation by the homeowner with the Jeep. The Jeep still haunted her thoughts. Even after being caught, even after facing police warnings, she couldn't let it go. To her, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of her failure. She replayed the moment of cutting the lock in her mind, the brief rush of triumph before the crushing reality of headlights behind her. She hated that it had been captured on camera, that her proudest act of enforcement had become evidence against her. Meanwhile, the homeowner continued with his quiet resolve. He didn't speak publicly, didn't boast about Karen's downfall, and didn't engage in the gossip swirling around the neighborhood. Instead, he focused on maintaining his property, reinforcing security measures, and cooperating with the police task force. His silence made him untouchable in the community's eyes, a stark contrast to Karen's loud, desperate attempts to reclaim relevance. Still, he wasn't without feeling. He had seen neighbors like Karen before, people consumed by control, blinded by their own self-righteousness, unable to recognize when they had gone too far. He knew that her story wasn't just about a broken lock in a Jeep, it was about years of unchecked behavior, about a person who had allowed power to twist into obsession. And though he felt no sympathy for her choices, he understood that her collapse was inevitable. Days passed, and Karen's isolation grew. Calls from her few remaining allies in the HOA went unanswered. Emails from board members demanding she cease her patrols were ignored. But her silence wasn't compliance, it was plotting. Deep down, Karen still believed she could turn things around. But if she could just prove the Jeep was in violation, she could reclaim her throne as the neighborhood's enforcer. What she didn't realize was that the law had already moved beyond HOA disputes. The Jeep wasn't just any vehicle, and the chain she had cut wasn't just a padlock. By tampering with it, she had interfered with a property tied directly to a police task force operation. What she saw as a petty neighborhood spat was now documented as obstruction. And though the police had shown restraint during their confrontation, the case was moving forward behind closed doors. Karen's world narrowed further. When an official letter arrived on one of her crafted notices, but a legal summons, her actions were under review, and the possibility of charges loomed. She read the letter over and over, her hands trembling, her denial faltering. For the first time, she couldn't rationalize her way out. The reality she had avoided was now undeniable. She was no longer in control. The neighborhood, meanwhile, thrived in her absence. Families planted flowers without fear of citations. Kids played basketball in driveways without Karen's disapproving glares. For the first time in years, laughter felt safe in the cul-de-sac. Neighbors spoke openly, gathering on porches to share relief that the reign of intimidation was over. The shift was so profound that even new families noticed, commenting on the warmth of the community. Karen watched all of this from her window. Each smile, each gathering, felt like a personal attack. She had always believed she was protecting the neighborhood, but now it seemed to flourish without her. The bitterness consumed her, leaving her restless, angry, and desperate for a way to prove she was right. But time was running out. Her reputation was destroyed, her influence dismantled, and her legal troubles mounting. The final act of her downfall was approaching. Whether she admitted it or not, the homeowner knew it. The board knew it. And deep down, Karen knew it too. The lock she broke wasn't just steal, it was the last barrier holding back the full force of consequences. And now, with every day that passed, that force was bearing down on her. The final unraveling of Karen's reign over the neighborhood came faster than anyone expected. Just a week after she received the summons, uniformed officers returned not with a warning this time, but with paperwork that carried the weight of consequence. The charges were clear: destruction of property, trespassing, and interference with law enforcement equipment. Her bold act of cutting that lock had been recorded from multiple angles: the homeowner's cameras, the body cams, from the responding officers, and even a few nosy neighbors who had watched from their windows. Karen had always loved being the center of attention. But now, every piece of evidence painted her as reckless, entitled, and dangerous. The law had no sympathy for her excuses. The day she was escorted away again, the cul-de-sac didn't hide their reactions. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and neighbors quietly exchanged looks of satisfaction. The woman who had once stood proudly in front of their houses with notices in hand was now reduced to a silent figure led into the back of a police vehicle. There was no shouting, no arguing, just the quiet hum of an ending that had been a long time coming. Her home, once the hub of her self-appointed authority, grew silent. The mailbox that had been stuffed with warning letters now collected only official notices addressed to her name. Her yard, once obsessively monitored, became overgrown. It was as though the house itself had surrendered, reflecting her absence. With each fading flower and patch of uncut grass, the HOA board moved swiftly in her absence. Without Karen's overbearing influence, meetings grew calmer. decisions became fairer, and rules were applied evenly instead of as weapons. The homeowners who had felt suffocated now felt relief. They planted gardens, painted fences, and even organized a neighborhood barbecue, something Karen would have shut down in an instant for being too disruptive. At that barbecue, laughter and the smell of grilled food filled the air. Children ran freely across lawns, parents chatted without fear of complaints. And the homeowner who had unknowingly sparked Karen's downfall by protecting his Jeep sat quietly among them, content to finally feel peace in his own community. He hadn't sought revenge. He had only wanted fairness. But sometimes, fairness requires that the truth catch up to those who refuse to see it. Karen, meanwhile, faced a reality she could no longer control. Court hearings loomed, fines stacked against her, and whispers about her reputation spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. Friends distanced themselves, allies abandoned her, and even family began to question her choices. The woman who once believed she was the protector of her neighborhood was now left with nothing but her own stubborn pride, and that pride had been shattered beyond repair. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when authority is twisted into obsession. The Jeep she tried to claim control over remained untouched, secured behind a brand new lock, a silent symbol of her downfall. And every time neighbors passed by, they didn't just see a vehicle, they saw the moment Karen's grip on the community finally broke. The homeowner never gloated, never sought to rub her downfall in her face. He didn't need to. The neighborhood itself had spoken, and the consequences had already been delivered. He simply lived his life, grateful that peace had returned, grateful that the shadow of constant harassment had finally lifted. In the end, Karen's legacy wasn't the rules she tried to enforce, but the lesson she unwillingly left behind, that no one, not even the loudest voice in the HOA, is above the law. End of story. Lovely outro for YouTube video, natural style, and that, my friends, is how one HOA Karen's obsession with control ended in her complete downfall. She thought she could bend the rules to her will, but in the end, the law had the final word. If you enjoyed this story, don't just scroll away, drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit the like button to show your support, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping HOA and Karen stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next one. And that, my friends, is how one HOA Karen's obsession with control ended in her complete downfall. She thought she could bend the rules to her will, but in the end, the law had the final word. If you enjoyed this story, don't just scroll away, drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit the like button to show your support, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping HOA and Karen stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next one.